Welcome back to The World in 2017. Our guest is the famous Asianomics founder and chief economist, Jim Walker. Jim, let me now come to the India question. What's your sense of the Indian economy's growth in 2017? Do you think the growth story was badly unsettled or jarred by the demonetization experiment? Or do you think the growth story is safe regardless?
Didn't jar the story of the structural story of India. I mean, I'm so positive about the demographics, the people here, the business attitude, the desire to grow, the desire for wealth. There's nothing could really derail that for me in terms of an India story. Governments are always there just to unsettle you from time to time, and certainly the demonetisation exercise was unsettling. It was a surprise in particular to me just in terms of the timing, because we had gone through a pretty weak period of capital goods investment and capital goods production. The thing that was holding growth together in India was a consumption story. And of course demonetisation, if anything, was going to derail the consumption story. So it was a bit of a surprise in terms of timing, but I suspect it was much more to do with politics than it was to do with economics in that respect. However, having said that, the great news going forward into 2017 is that we've had a good monsoon. Now, the monsoon, in my view, is a much bigger issue as regards fiscal expenditure than economic growth generally. Two bad monsoons in a row meant that the government had to divert resources towards rural income support. The good monsoon this year has meant that the government can now focus on capital spending, infrastructure spending, boosting the economy. And that means that the demonetisation downside is probably going to be much, much more limited than people were perhaps expecting in November 2016. So, as long as that happens, and I think that's what the budget was suggesting, we might have a very pleasant experience with Indian growth in 2017 and even better going into 2018 and 19.
Okay. Well, would you say that India will not get any help in terms of even further lower cost of money? You think the Reserve Bank is at the end of the rate cutting cycle?
Well, you know, one of the things that we look at is, rather than the official interest rates, we look at what we call real lending rates. And we calculate these on the basis of the existing lending rate in India deflated by the nominal GDP growth rate. And interestingly, over the last few quarters, those real lending rates have been falling.
Yes.
In fact, India's real lending rates are really quite appropriate at the moment. And of course also it's the case that despite the central bank holding off in the last two meetings, lending rates in the banking system have come down because liquidity in the banking system has gone up. So I would say interest rates are pretty appropriate just now. I don't know whether the central bank really needs to do very much more. Personally, I might have wanted them to cut another 25, 50 basis points, but I don't think there's any rush to do that, and I don't think there's any great necessity that should happen. I think the outlook for growth is fine. The interest rate signal is good. The external balance has improved dramatically when we take into account direct investment flows. And India is actually looking really pretty good going into 2017.
Well, private capital investment hasn't been forthcoming, and a large number of banks, especially banks that lend to companies, are faced with a lot of default debt, bad debt. Would that STIMI lending, would that be a bottleneck?
Well, I'm not quite certain that the private sector is going to be the sector that's going to step up in terms of the investment cycle in the near term. I think really the government is in the driving seat on this, and that's certainly been signalled by the budget as well. But if the government does get its act together and starts moving into a higher gear in that respect, then we should expect the private sector to follow, because economic activity will pick up. And as I say, when we look at the real lending rate picture in India, it's really not a hurdle for the private investment side to start moving. More of a hurdle is indeed the bad debts in the banking system, and more is going to be done over the course of this year to address that issue with the recognition of non-performing loans coming in April. So the private sector is probably going to lag the public sector in this cycle as regards the investment upturn. I'm pretty certain that once the investment upturn is signalled, the private sector will be jumping in the back of that fairly quickly, given where interest rates are.
Okay. Typically in a country or in an economy in this stage, what should investors be looking for? What kind of sectors? Should they be chasing consumption stocks? Should they be chasing finance stocks? Private sector, public sector? What would you have them chase?
Yeah, well, I still think that the industrials are going to be good plays in India over the course of the next couple of years. I think the investment cycle that will be kick-started by the government will play right through into the industrials, into capital goods industries. You know, I've always been a bit shy of saying that it's a good time to buy financials. But one of the recommendations that we made to clients at the beginning of this year was a high conviction global strategy trade of being short European financials and long Indian financials, which really play into the theme that we put out in our year-end strategy report, which we called World War III. By the way, nothing to do with Donald Trump, but more the fact that there's a real force of demographics, positive for India and negative for other parts of the world, including Europe. And I think this is a time that people should be loading up in Indian financials and just holding them for the next 20 years.
Well, already in this first 7 weeks of the year, they would have made money if they had got this advice. But Jim, you know, speaking about making money in India, and let me end where we began with global impulse and especially impulses from the US. IT, Infotech, has made a lot of money for investors in India over the last 2 decades. The Donald Trump policies look like stemming that, his visa policies as well as isolationist policies. Would you bet on IT in particular, and in general, do you think Donald Trump can stymie trade and stymie global growth?
Well, at some point, Mr. Trump's going to come to his senses and see where his bread is buttered. I mean, refusing visas to Indian IT engineers and entrepreneurs is one way of making sure that the US economy just falls flat in its face again. I think you'll have enough advisors out there telling him that this is maybe a silly policy that is to the detriment of making America great again rather than to its benefit. If, on the other hand, they don't do that and he continues with his policies to stop people coming into the country, then maybe Indians are just going to stay at home and make their money here and look to the domestic economy and the rest of the world as the places for Indian IT to be sold, and I'd be very comfortable with that.
Okay. Well, since you're such a close India watcher, let me just add one last question. There are a spate of state elections, provincial elections that are happening in India. If it were to happen that the current ruling party, the NDA, doesn't quite make it in all the big states, would you worry, or would you use that as an opportunity only to add more to Indian investments?
Yeah, it might unsettle some foreign investors and maybe some Indian investors if the current government didn't win in these elections. But you know, to be quite honest, for us, this has never been a story about the Modi government or the BJP. It's always been a story about the platform that India starts from today relative to other countries in the rest of the world. The youth of the country, the stage that the country's at in its development and in its cycle. I mean, for me, the political side is much more of a sideshow. The structural story of India is sound under a BJP government as under any other government.
Jim Walker, it's always a pleasure listening to you. Thank you very much for giving us a perspective of the way the world economy is shaping up, and thank you for making us feel good about ourselves.
Pleasure for doing that.
Well, that's it on this very special edition of The World in 2017. Thanks for watching.